And hello, everybody out there in the cyber universe. Welcome to another exciting episode of the John White Speaker Series. Now, but thank you all for joining us today, and I'm very hopeful that we'll all, I'm not hopeful, I know that we're all going to learn quite a bit and have a good time. In case this is your first time joining us for one of these, thank you very much. And the John White Speaker Series, this is actually the 19th year that we are doing this here at the Northwest Montana Historical Society, usually spread out between 4 or 5 or 6 weeks in the middle of winter for all of us to come together at the museum as a community and have some hot chocolate and some cookies and really learn a little bit more about the big wide world around us. Speaking of the big wide world around us, 2020 has changed things temporarily quite a bit. So this year we're doing this all over the digital cybersphere, and unfortunately we're not being able to meet together, but hopefully you can, grab your family and your nearby friends and keep it social distance, but enjoy this in the comfort of your own home as well. And then we can still continue to reach more people and build what we are building here and really fulfill our mission of bringing Montana history to the public. John White, of course, was the longtime custodian here at the Central School in Kalispell. Served his community for almost half a century here in this building and with the Kalispell school system. And it's interesting because John White was an African American, and that's a community that really gets glossed over quite a bit when you're telling the history of this fine state that we live in. You just don't hear about the many African Americans who helped build this place. And so we have a tiny little bit of a connection to today's program as well. Maybe another community that has been marginalized a little bit by history that we're now kind of trying to shine a little bit more light on so that we get the full, complete story of Montana history and how we all came to be. Today I am being joined, I'm very happy to announce that I'm being joined by Dr. Bridget Kevane from MSU Bozeman. Bridget is the professor of Latino Studies and actually the whole director of the Liberal Studies program down there in Bozeman, and it's quite a long way. So hey, if there's any silver lining that we can take from this digital format of 2021, I mean, this is something that we might not have been able to do in a year where we're having everybody meet here at the museum. So it's a big change, and we have to take our lumps with it for sure, but it's also allowing us to do a lot more and talk to a lot more people. So thank you very much for joining us today, Bridget.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure on this kind of balmy day, as you mentioned. As you also mentioned, my name is Bridget Kevane. I've been a professor at Montana State University for about 23 years, maybe this is my 24th. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, which I never imagined that I'd end up here in Montana, but here I am. And my area of specialty is Latino studies. That's the study of the Latino Latinx community in the United States and also here in Montana. So I guess if there's nothing else, I can start sharing the screen and get started.
Sure, well, absolutely. I do want to make a quick mention that this program is also brought to us today from Humanities Montana. Great organization that does a lot of the liberal arts studies and programs around the state. They usually bring 1 or 2 people to Kalispell in the winter. So we're thankful that they helped us have Bridget here today to teach us all something new. And if anybody wants to learn more about what they do or wants to support their cause, more information can be found at humanitiesmontana.org. That's all I have and so take it away.
All right, I'm going to share my screen now. Can everybody see that?
I think we can. Well, I can, so yep.
Okay. And I like what you said at the start about kind of these communities that are semi-marginalized or invisible to our general knowledge, but yet they've helped build the state and continue to help build the state. And that is very true of the Latino community here in Montana. So when we say Latino, I usually start by a couple questions. Who are they? Why are they here? Where do they come from? And what do they do? And
Bridget, can I stop you really quick?
Sure.
So we are seeing all of your slides to the left here, and in addition to the big slide in the middle.
Interesting. Let me do.
Yep. If you go to that slideshow, I think
yeah.
you can get presentation view or something. Yep, there you go.
Okay.
Yep, now we're on track.
Perfect. So, as you know, the Latino community is very complex, and even the label for Latinos is very complex. There's a lot of debate about whether to call them this group of Spanish-speaking community members here in the United States, Latino, Hispanic, Latinx. And it's mostly, when we talk about it in broad terms, it's a useful label, Latinos, but it does mean, and it points to very complicated, very unique cultures within the Latino label. So the majority of Latinos in the United States are Mexicans. Then there's a dramatic drop to Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans, which are Hispanic Caribbeans, then Central Americans, Hondurans, Salvadorians, and Guatemalans, for example. These are just the largest categories. And this, most of the census data that you're going to see is from either the Pew Hispanic Center or the US Census Bureau. So as a nation, you can see here that from 1970 to 2019, and then the projections, the Latino community has grown in a very substantial way. So in 1970, there were about 9.6 million. And then right now, there's about 60 to 63 million. And by 2060, the projection is that there will be 119 million, which is kind of almost a third of the US population, so significant. And here in Montana, we're trending along with national numbers. 2000, we had about 18,000 in the state, and now in 2020, the census is predicting that we're going to see a growth to 4%, maybe 44,000 Latinos in the state. And as I mentioned, the large share of the Latino community in the states are Mexican. And then there is a significant drop to Puerto Rican, Cuban, Salvadorian, Dominican, and other Latino and Hispanics. That statistic about the Mexicans is true here in Gallatin County as well. I mean, in Montana. Here's just in numbers in Montana counties. Gallatin County has about 44,568. Billings or Yellowstone County has the largest community at 8,149. And then your county, Flathead County, the US Bureau says you have about 3% out of 103,000. So probably you have roughly 3,000 Hispanics in Flathead County. And Kalispell itself, it's saying that 2.9% of your 24,000 are Hispanic. So that's not insignificant. Then just to get some national facts about the community, some things that folks might find interesting. About 32% are under the age of 17. And this is important because it's the youngest of the major racial ethnic groups in the United States. It's a young community, in other words. 55% are Catholic. Evangelicals have made inroads into the Latino community, but it's still the majority is Catholic. They make up the largest group of immigrants in most states in the United States. 68% of Latinos age 5 and up speak English proficiently. So there are lots of myths that are debunked by the actual, if you look at what the numbers are saying about Latinos, they do speak English. US-born Latinos are increasing. Foreign-born is decreasing. 19% poverty rate, 16% lacking health insurance, 15% age 25 and over had a BA, 67% graduated from high school, and 9% voted in 2016. I haven't seen the recent statistics, but for sure, more Latinos voted in this election than probably ever before. So now to get into Latino Montana. As is true of many people in the state and many in other states, there's economic pulls that draws people to the state. And Montana is no exception. So you can break down the migrant streams into the state by the 1800s, then 1900s, and then in the 21st century in the 2000s, we're seeing kind of a different economic pull. But the main point of this presentation is that Montana, like the rest of the nation, has labor needs, and Latinos have filled those labor needs. And as you pointed out earlier, Jacob, have helped build the infrastructure of this state. So one of the earliest touches, and I call them touches because there's not a lot of deep research on the folks that I'm going to mention now, but one of our earliest examples of a Latino in the state is Manuel Lisa. So Manuel Lisa is, you know, he came into the state for fur trapping. He was of Spanish descent. He was born and raised in Louisiana, in New Orleans specifically, and he kind of crossed paths with Lewis and Clark and was galvanized by the expedition of Lewis and Clark and led his first trading expedition in the early 1800s into Montana. He established the Missouri Fur Company, and his second in command was, we think, a Mexican named Benito Vasquez. Some say he was Spaniard, some say he was Mexican, it's unknown. So we don't have a lot about his second in command, but Manuel Lisa created that first Missouri Fur Company, and then between 1806 and 1812, he established Fort Raymond, which is now, or was then later named Fort Manuel Lisa, which we're gonna see a map of 30 miles east of Billings, kind of before you get to Miles City. And so, you know, along with trading in fur with the native indigenous communities here, more Spaniards were drawn to this area because of the rich fur trading, especially the beaver trapping in the Northern Rockies. And you can see some other facts down here around this time. Mexico got its independence from Spain in 1821. In 1829, there were many Hispanos employed at Fort Union. There were Hispano or Latino wranglers working at Fort Union. So again, these are little touches that we know of, but the bottom line is they were drawn here for economic reasons as well. Hispanos brought adobe construction techniques to the upper Missouri. Archaeologists discovered Mexican artifacts at Fort Union. And then I just want to show you Manuel Lisa before going forward. And here you can see where the site of Fort Raymond would have been. And here is an old image of his fort being built. And you can see a native member standing as kind of a sentry and workers building up the walls. So there was a lot of fur trading, fur trapping, and setting up of trading posts. And when that kind of faded in the 1840s, fur trapping and trading, there was a turn to cattle ranching. And Johnny Grant he's not Hispanic, but he established Deer Lodge, the Grant Coors Ranch, and he brought in quite a bit of Mexican laborers because this was also during the time of the Mexican-American War. And the Mexican-American War fought between 1846 to 48. People would cross the border from Texas, which was part of Mexico, into the United States and set down roots. Just like any war, it displaced folks. And here you can see Andrew Garcia was one of those. And here's just more images of fur trading. Here's the Grant Coors Ranch. So quite a few ranchers on his ranching place. Sorry, I'm having, oh, there we go. Hold on 1 second. There we go. We're Mexican. And then Andrew Garcia also he mixed the two industries or two trades. He was a Mexican. He wrote a memoir called Tough Trip Through Paradise, which is really fun to read. And he was both a vaquero, a cattle rancher, and a fur trader. So again, those are just the first touches of our history with Hispanics in the state. As acres of land were open to by the railway, we brought in a lot of Latinos also to lay the tracks. And here you can see, this is not the earliest timetable, but you can see the Great Northern Railway Company had a timetable from 1950, which this was very exciting for Northern. The High Line had the first railways going through, and a lot of Mexicans laid the tracks of these Great Northern Railways, bringing in more Hispanics into the state. Here's a group of Mexican traqueros is what they're called, laying the tracks, traqueros. I think this image is from Utah, but I'm guessing that Mexican traqueros in Montana, you could find similar photos. Here's railway workers in Montana in 1887, and I got this from the Great Northern Railway Archives, actually. And if you look closely, you can see all kinds of people laying tracks and working on the railways. And here's a maintenance crew from 1940 in Montana. So we had fur trapping, we had cattle ranching, and then at the turn of the century, we had the traqueros and all the people that come in of Hispanic descent slowly. Some stay and build roots, others leave. More traqueros. And then, it's really at the turn of the century, in the beginning of the 19th century, that we have what draws the biggest and most stable Hispanic community to Montana. And that, as many of you probably know, is sugar beets. The sugar beet industry from 1915 to 1975 almost depended on laborers to cultivate the sugar beet crops. And Great Western Sugar was one of the largest companies. The other one is in Sydney and Harding, that brought in Hispanic workers and also created the first, what's called colonia, the first kind of settlement of Hispanics in Billings. So here you can see Sydney Sugars. These are the two big companies that created kind of company towns. And Hispanics, mostly Mexicans, worked to establish to work in those fields. Great Western Sugar Company and Holly Sugar Company were the two big companies again. And what they would do was send what today we call coyote, and back then they called coyotes as well. They're recruiters that would go into either southern United States or into Mexico and recruit workers to work in the fields of the sugar beet industry. The workers in Spanish are called betabeleros, and you'll see that slowly but surely these workers established homes. They managed to have an education, get a school. Great Western Sugar Company decided that they had to educate the Mexicans, or the Mexicans decided that Great Western Sugar owed them a school for their kids. Our Lady of Guadalupe Church was built. So here you can see that more or less in 1930, there were 1,000 Mexican and Mexican Americans living in Yellowstone Valley. And Great Western Company bought Billings Sugar, became the largest sugar producer in 1917. And they began recruiting laborers. Now, the interesting thing about these sugar companies is that they also brought in German workers, but it was a two-tier labor hierarchy. The Mexicans were not allowed to buy land, the Germans were. So one of the problems that Great Western Sugar faced was this circular migration. They had a hard time keeping their laborers, their Mexican laborers, in Billings, because there's a dead time during sugar beet processing, and they would leave for other work in other fields. So Great Western decided to build what's called the colonia, a little housing industry, which I'm going to show you here. Here are betabeleros working. And here's an example of La Colonia. So they provided the Mexican laborers with housing supplies so that they can build their own little adobe homes, and hopefully then stay winter over and not leave. Let me go back to some of the images of the betabeleros. Whoops. You can see how it's back-breaking work. They're hoeing the field. You had to top the sugar beet off. So they built La Colonia, and in the hopes of keeping their workers over the winter, as I said, here's the church that they built, La Virgen de Guadalupe. And before I get to that, to mining, which was the other industry, I just wanted to say that while the most recent migrant farm worker population in Montana is families that travel now to Flathead to pick the cherries, really the most comprehensive migrant farm worker community was because of the sugar beet workers, and that was also both Eastern Sydney and Billings. Back in 1967, the Office of Public Instruction actually had its first federal grant to provide instructional and educational support to children of the Mexican families who came to work in the Flathead cherry. But before that, as I mentioned, Great Western felt the need to educate the kids that were out of school when they were working in the sugar beet industry. They'd be dropped out of school and then back in school, out of school. And we see this today as well. There's this cycle of interrupted education as we depend on Mexican laborers to supply us with the things that, are industries here in the state. The other big draw was Anaconda Mining, 1881 to 1980, another company town, but this company town was built around mining. So you have these what are called company towns built around industries that then require labor. And this one too was built by many Mexicans, Sonorans, Nuevo Mexicanos, which were the Mexicans from New Mexico before New Mexico became part of the United States, and Chileans. And as you probably all know, Anaconda, the butte was called the richest hill on earth. And here you can see some of the miners. But getting back to Billings and La Colonia, because that's where we have most of the history, one of the things that scholars like to point out is workers come and go, but always a certain percentage of the sugar beet workers or the mining or the traqueros or the fur trappers set down roots in Montana. So you can see in these beautiful images, these are residents of Billings in La Colonia that not only set down roots, but began establishing their traditions. So some of these images are from Mexican Independence Day in Billings. Here's a typical wedding in Billings. These are, this was from an interview, I think in the 80s, from the grandchildren of the first members of La Colonia in Billings. It came out in, I think, the Billings Gazette. This is part of the history of the Billings City Schools and talks about kind of what I was mentioning, that Great Western Sugar Company realized that it had to educate the children of its workers. So they created what was called the Mexican School. And it just is a little blurb on what happened in establishing that. More members or descendants of La Colonia. You can vaguely see La Virgen de Guadalupe in the background in the picture there, Virgin Mary. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Bracero program, but this supports kind of this important theme in the United States, which is when we have a labor shortage, we create and recruit workers from underdeveloped or non-first world countries. And the Bracero program was an agreement between the United States and Mexico, where during World War II it was started. We would be able to avail ourselves of millions of Mexican workers to come into the fields. And if you go into the Bracero Program archive, you can find little snapshots of where Mexicans went and where they worked. And this young man, Ignacio Nájera, was actually from Chihuahua, Mexico. And he came into the cotton fields of Texas and New Mexico and then traveled to the beet fields of Montana and Nebraska. So what his little snapshot shows us is how circular these laborers are. In other words, sometimes they wouldn't stay in one place. They go where the crops need picking or where they need to be in the fields. And so they travel different routes. And here you can see that he went from cotton to beets, and then probably he went on to other agricultural needs. This is an image of recruitment for Mexican workers. The Bracero program was only Mexican men. Women weren't allowed to come to the program, and we're going to see that this is a shift to contemporary labor needs, where a lot of women have come in to fill some of Montana's needs. And you would simply show some papers. You had to be of a certain age. You couldn't be too old. You couldn't be too young. You had to be healthy, and you were allowed to come into the United States and work. From the many millions that came in, again, a percentage set down roots and stayed, and probably many went on to get papers and become legal here in the United States. Today, in the 21st century, really it started in the late 1990s into the early 2000s, we have new needs. And one of the fastest growing areas that is seeking labor is here in Gallatin County. But as you know, Flathead and its Flathead cherries, which is part of Kalispell, York County, still hires Mexican laborers. They come in once a year, every summer, to harvest those delicious Flathead cherries. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the migrant education camp that Rural Employment Opportunities runs every summer for the kids of the Flathead cherry pickers, but here's some images. Some of my students have done this, where they volunteer or work with migrant education camp and teach the kids. Math and English are the two areas. There are many economic polls for the Mexican labor, and many Hondurans are now part of this labor venue. Dillon has potatoes and sheep. Big Sky is construction and service. Flathead, you have the cherries. Libby is lumber. West Yellowstone is the service industry. Belgrade and Bozeman, service and construction, and Manhattan, dairy. I'm mostly focused on Gallatin County because it's the county that I know best, where the Mexican or Honduran laborers are working. What I mentioned briefly, that the migrant streams used to only be men, but more and more women came into the migrant stream, especially to work in the hotels. Many of the women from Honduras that I work with now are the cleaners in hotels. In West Yellowstone, many of the Mexican women are working in hotels as well, cleaning. And there's also been quite a bit of action around Gallatin County because of the tremendous growth of Hispanic workers. I don't know if similar actions are taking place in other parts of the state, but I can tell you that, of course, Bozeman is bluer than the rest of the state, so there is quite a bit of we welcome the stranger in Gallatin County, and all these initiatives were started back in 2006, and they have continued till today. They focused around education, spiritual needs, translation, connecting students to healthcare access, to justice access, community health workers, and there's a lot going on in the county now. Again, I don't know that there are similar initiatives around the state because of these are very political moves. Even though they're social, they're also politicized. And a lot of these programs are meant to address the needs of undocumented workers in the county. But as you probably guessed, there's also quite a bit of anti-immigration sentiment in the state, and the legislature, over I think 4 legislative sessions, our state legislators have tried to pass 28 anti-immigrant bills. They had almost all been vetoed by the governor, except for LR 121, which was approved, but then immigration attorney sued and it was overturned in 2014. I don't know what this current legislature will do, but it'll be interesting to see how they try and, if they try and pass any anti-immigration bills, which usually have to do with providing undocumented workers with access to state health care or clinics or educational services. Here's just a couple fun facts about the Latino community in Montana. In 1959, after Fidel Castro took over, there was what was called Operation Peter Pan, where children were airlifted out of Cuba to different parts of the United States to save the children from Fidel's communist takeover. And about 100 of those children were brought to Helena. Also, we have a famous kind of singer, Chan Romero from Billings, who had I think a very popular song called the Hippie Hippie Shake. I'm trying to think, I think it was a bestseller, I don't know what. We also had Montana Migrant Council was established in 1971. And in 1980, the Legislative Assembly created a formal report about Hispanics in Montana, which is fascinating and you can still find online. Part of what that report said was that I'm just going to read this part. Treatment of Hispanics throughout the society comes through attempts to characterize them simplistically. Little attention is paid to diversity within the Hispanic communities, and all Hispanics are conveniently lumped into an arbitrarily homogeneous group. While agencies of academy and government revel in orgies of classification, the reality of the Hispanic existence denies classification into categories created for the convenience of those who may be ill-prepared both temperamentally and intellectually with the social and cultural kaleidoscope that is the Hispanic community in Montana. So back in 1980, the legislative 46th Montana Assembly was recognizing the diversity within the Hispanic community. Finally, here's John Romero's Hippie Hippie Shake. And I can see, I thought I could play a clip of it.
Yeah, we hear it.
I'm not going to play the whole thing, but you can find it on YouTube. It's I had the pleasure of interviewing him, and he has an amazing story to tell about being Mexican here in Montana and then becoming a famous pop star for a brief moment. I'll end just by pointing out that the Lewis and Clark Library is going to have a talk on January 7th with this journalist, Luis Alberto Rea, who is well known because of his work on the border, but also as a novelist. So maybe members of your community, it will be online, can go on to the Lewis and Clark Library and attend this talk with Luis Alberto Rea. So I think that's it for now. And Jacob, if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Sure. We can, you can end the screen share and we can pop back to, yep, there we go.
Yeah.
This is better, right?
Yeah.
So I do have a couple
of information in a nutshell.
No, thank you so much. Like you said, this is, and I grew up in Michigan, so I don't know if they teach this in the elementary schools here. If it was anything like, my elementary school in Michigan, was probably glossed over very quickly. So this is probably a whole bunch of new stuff for a lot of people actually watching this right now, which is excellent.
Yeah.
I guess my first question is just the big umbrella question. So the term Latino, when did this start being used, kind of on a wider national scale? And is it simply an umbrella for people with the kind of Latin language origin? Is it language oriented? Because of course it casts a pretty wide net over all of those people from, many, many different countries south of us that have pretty varied cultural and societal norms.
Yeah, it's really, it's kind of just an efficient label meant to capture Spanish-speaking or non-white Hispanic communities in the United States. Even if you're Latino, many of the families don't speak Spanish. Right. So so let me backtrack a little. First, one of the first labels we had was Hispanic, and it had a functional purpose. It was meant to add something to the census that could capture this kind of growing minority community in the United States. And that didn't identify as white because they were Mexican or they were Guatemalan or they were Honduran or Puerto Rican, etc. So Hispanic was the first kind of catch-all. Before that, it was just Mexican, and of course, Puerto Ricans are not Mexicans, and
Right.
Cubans are not Mexicans, and Guatemalans are not Mexicans. And Hispanic kind of is still used, but basically there was a shift to Latino maybe in the 1990s, around maybe a little earlier. And you can see in the academy, for example, a kind of growth of Latino studies centers in universities across the nation. And again, it was meant to just be a fairer umbrella term. But the thing about umbrella terms is there's never anything fair about them. And now, currently, the Academy has moved to Latino with an X at the end to be gender inclusive as well. I use Latino just as shorthand. It's kind of code for Mexicans, Guatemalans, Puerto Ricans, I mean the whole diversity.
Right.
But you're right, there's such tremendous difference. And it's really come up recently over the election, where one of the stereotypes was that most Latinos will vote Democratic, and there are many Latinos that are Republicans through and through, have supported Trump, and it's not automatic that because you're Latino, you're, anti-Trump or anti-Republican. So yes, the umbrella term is both, it's useful and not useful at the same time.
Right. Yeah, and as you said, as they almost always are. To just kind of localize thing and also, to talk a little bit about Northwest Montana history. So most of the early Latino population that was here in Kalispell and in Whitefish and, basically anywhere on the west side of the divide, that probably then came with the railroad, correct? The laying of the tracks of the Great Northern Line. And so a lot of that then,
trapping and the railroad.
Oh, okay, got it, right. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. I read Tough Trip Through Paradise, and I found it was fascinating.
Oh, you did?
Oh yeah. It took me a little while, but it was a fun read. You're right. It was a really good read. And while reading it, you almost don't even think of the background of your narrator. You don't think of how and why and all the factors that brought him, here to the mountains in Montana, trapping and trading and everything like that, which is pretty fascinating. Because the experience back then, it almost seemed like that's certainly not standard, but it almost seemed like something that you and correct me if I'm wrong, but did the race and background, was there a lot of discrimination and kind of a different experience for people of different ethnicities back in the trading and the trapping days, of course?
That's such a good question. I don't really have a solid answer on that. I can say that before Montana became a state, it drew people from, many racial, ethnic backgrounds. And of course, because it was so wild in some regards, you had to depend on neighbors, whether they be the indigenous tribes that were here or Asians left over from after the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. There was a mix, and the stereotyping was different in the sense that, at least from what I can gather, I don't, you can't quote me on this, but because it was a frontier territory, that people depended on each other, but also labeled each other. There's a Mexican, there's a Chinese, there's a this. But I don't know about the actual direct prejudice and discrimination. And you're right, because Andrew Garcia never really mentions this. And the Johnny Coors memoir, Johnny Grant, also talks about quite a few Mexican employees that he has, but never, there's not that deep article or books or memoirs that I've found yet that really talks about discrimination. It's not to say it wasn't there, but
because in Garcia's book, it was almost like you were either an American Indian or you were everybody else. Like those were the two factions.
Exactly.
Those were where he actually took the time to spell out the
Yeah.
actual typical ethnicity, which I kind of found fascinating, especially as you are, reading this book by this, early resident who just happened to be Latino, but almost very little is actually made mention of it.
Right. And in part, that probably has to do with the people coming in and kind of taking over the territory and driving the economy at the expense of a lot of the native traditions. So
Right.
I know there was quite a bit of conflict and quite a bit of allyship between different indigenous tribes and the Southwest Mexican peoples, and I'm sure that characterized what was going on in Montana as well. So, but you're right, it was everyone else and then the indigenous
Right.
communities.
And so the other thing that I found pretty fascinating as you were speaking, these land buying restrictions, were these just the sugar beet companies themselves saying, "Oh yeah, we will hire you. We're just not going to allow you to work for us and own property at the same time"? Or was this more of a local government or statewide government, or so it was kind of internalized?
This is, yeah, it's the history of the Southwest vis-a-vis Mexicans and what they could own and couldn't. So Montana was not unique and Great Western was
Right.
not unique. If you turn to, what happened to Mexicans after the Mexican-American War, through legal systems, Mexicans lost almost 90% of the territory that they owned.
Right.
After the war. So they'd be these, landowners of many, many acres, and either they couldn't produce the titles because it just had been inherited over centuries, right. Spaniards and then Mexicans. And so it was kind of pretty typical of that time where Mexicans were fighting for the right to own land. And that is clear prejudice. They were the second-tier citizens of the United States from the 1900s to even to the 1960s, to the Civil Rights Movement. And even today we're seeing it manifested in different ways around the immigration rhetoric. So it wasn't unique to Great Western. I don't know if Holly Sugars had the same kind of that they prevented betabeleros from owning tracts of land. But I do know that Great Western has these manuals that include how to take care of your tools and instruments and how to, take care of your sugar crop. And Mexican laborers are part of the tools that sugar beet owners are said, and treat your Mexicans like you would your prized hoe or whatever. Right. So they, it was a mixed bag. They provided them with the colonia. They eventually provided them with the school, not out of the benevolence of their hearts, but because they wanted the community they wanted a labor community that was steady.
Right.
So
right.
I don't think it was unique to Great Western sugar.
Yeah. And so I guess I kind of have a little bit of the same kind of question, but bringing it to, our current times today. You showed the numbers earlier about the population of Latino in Montana. And, Montana in general, especially here in Western Montana and in, Bozeman, it's growing by leaps and bounds, it seems like, with, people of every, ethnic background. And it was just amazing that the numbers in Yellowstone County doubled, and then the numbers in your own county have tripled. And I know you showed the kind of work that these new Latino residents of the state are actually engaged in. But where else do you attribute that to? Just the onslaught and almost unprecedented growth in the region of actually what's happening and everybody moving here, and so Latinos then come here for one, the same reasons as everybody else, but also because they're in the construction fields and in the service industry, things like that.
That's exactly right. I think if Gallatin County is a microcosm of what's happening at the national level and even in the state, you're right. There's, you know, Peruvians that are moving here because they want the same way of life that, you know, white people want that are moving here from New York or San
Right.
Francisco or Dallas. It's a quality of life that's being sought after. So you have kind of these two streams, the the migrants that are coming from other states seeking a quality of life, and a percentage of those are Latinos, just like, you know, anywhere else. And you have the stream that is here building the lifestyle that people that are moving from Texas, San Francisco, New York, or Miami are seeking. But you also have the agriculture that is still drawing great numbers of Mexican laborers. And we're also seeing people fleeing because of the situation in their country. So we've seen a growth of Venezuelans come into Montana because of the situation in Venezuela, the disaster that is Venezuela now. We're seeing many Hondurans come in because of the drug trafficking and gangs and the state of government in Honduras. So there's these pushes from sending countries, and there's these pulls. We want laborers to build our dream homes, and we're also receiving migrants that are fleeing persecution, and we're also seeing an influx, like I said, of, you know, people moving here for the quality of life, just like and a lot of Latinos actually are moving here from California because they dream of what we dream of: clean air, space, rivers, blue skies, nature. So it's definitely a mix. And the Latino population, like I said in one of the stats, is the foreign-born population isn't growing, but the Latino population born here is growing.
Right. And so, yeah, so they are just pursuing the American dream, just like, you know, everybody else, all the other recent arrivals to the Big Sky countries. You know, I've only been here on a permanent basis for 4 years, but you know, it's funny that even in my 4 years, I've seen changes here, and Kalispell seems to be just a little bit behind Bozeman and all of these kind of national trends. You know, I looked at a recent number, so I forget where I saw it, but Kalispell's like the third fastest growing small city in America. And I'm sure Bozeman is number one, you know, because these are the two fastest growing parts of Montana, which is in itself, the western side of Montana is one of the fastest growing states in the union. So I'm interested to see if those same patterns are, you know, kind of emerge here in the Flathead as well.
Yeah, I'd be really interested in seeing that too. I mean, you know, I'm mostly interested in seeing how communities react to newcomer communities coming in. And even though I kind of went quickly over the anti-immigration bills, it can really divide counties and communities if there's not action around how to incorporate, integrate, best serve these new communities. So I'd be interested in seeing where Kalispell, I think after the next census results come out, where the growth is in the Hispanic community, what the local schools are saying, because that's where you'll see a lot of attention being paid. And the health community, I mean, health people delivering healthcare will also see growth if there is growth. And, you know, I mean, people will tend to get very political about immigration and say, well, they shouldn't be here, they broke the law, and that's fine. But once you have a community, you want them to become productive citizens of the state. And because they're contributing to the economy, whether you know it or not, the more people that are coming here to work, whether documented or not, they're buying food, they're going to your local stores, they're buying houses, they're contributing to the economy and deserve the right to have a quality of life in those communities. So it gets more and more complicated as more and more migrants come into communities. So it'll be interesting to see how Kalispell tracks and what your county does with if there is significant growth.
Sure. Yeah. It's certainly going to be interesting, and you know, I'm glad that we were able to touch on, you know, so much of the past and how we got to where we are now, and then, you know, kind of wrapping it up with, you know, how we are going to look in the future. I think that's kind of what I aim for all these John White speaker series. So that's really, in my opinion, that's a perfect place to end it. If you have anything else?
No, I think, yeah, just, I mean, we don't know a lot about the Hispanic community in the 1800s, but I think the takeaway is that they're drawn here for quality of life and the economy. So it's a push and pull, and Kalispell is certainly part of that. If you have about 3,000 Latinos in the county, you know, I think this talk is more than anything, are you going to welcome the community? Is the community what kind of community is it going to be in the future? So it's a perfect place to end. Yeah.
And I agree. It's going to be fascinating to see what comes. So Bridget, thank you very much for joining us today. Oh yeah, we're happy to have you. You know, I personally learned a ton, so thank you so much. And for everybody watching out there, in the cyberspace universe, we have 3 other John White presentations this year. So I encourage you, if you enjoyed this, take a look around and then check out our other 3 presentations. Perfect way to get you through the winter. And we'll hopefully see you back here at the museum in the spring or the fall. So once again, thank you very much, Bridget. And that will end it here for today's John White series.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.